The dialogue Gorgias begins by discussing rhetoric and goes on to discuss what is just. Our discussion omits the discussion of rhetoric, first between Socrates and Gorgias and then Socrates and Polus, and begins with Socrates' paradoxical conclusions and the indignant intervention of Callicles as the rest stand around. The scene is set in the house of Callicles, and Socrates begins by saying that rhetoric cannot excuse one from doing injustice. What starts then is a political discussion between Callicles' view, which he first presents as a distinction, as juxtaposition between nature and convention, and Socrates' own position by doing his normal stuff, by doing a Socratic method to get him to admit the opposite often of what he said before. So Callicles pits nature against convention in the sense that what is natural is supposed to be good, and these things which people say, conventional things they adhere to and say are just, are to be avoided, and they're just invented. And Socrates, being a philosopher, is too much involved in examining things, and so he tries to say, well, Socrates, you do too much philosophy, but I'll give you the point that not enough philosophy or too little philosophy is bad as well. Socrates responds with his doubtful stance, and trying to start the discussion, and first praising Callicles and saying, well, we have all the things that we need to test the soul, he claims. We have knowledge, goodwill, and outspokenness, namely you, Callicles, which are more outspoken, for example, than Polus. And you're able to say these things to me, and I hope you will be truthful in what you say. Are you willing to have this discussion with me, and so on? He, by nature, he asks, what do you really mean? Do you mean the better, as in the superior, or the stronger? And Callicles agrees, and even quotes Pindar, saying, well, the natural law is what Pindar meant when he said the law is the king of all, of mortals as well as of immortals. This, as he says, makes might to be right, end quote. Against what he considers to be the artificial law which we invent and impose upon our fellows. The many, Socrates then tries to question this by saying that the many, aren't they the stronger? Aren't they, with your logic, the superior then and the better? But surely you don't mean this. Surely you want to say also that the more courageous and wiser is perhaps the better and superior. Callicles agrees, because the many are always stronger than the individual. So it can't be that you think that the better is the stronger. What Pindar said. He gives then a definition of what he means by natural justice. When Socrates asks Callicles answers, quote, natural justice is that the better and wiser should rule and have more than the inferior. End quote. Now we have a kind of a definition to go with, but Socrates is not convinced and asks, well, what do you mean by have more? Does that mean your ruler, your ideal superior person, your natural law guy, is to be indulgent and to be desirous and intemperate? Whereas Socrates thinks that he should have no desires, should be temperate as a person. But Callicles insists and says, well, no, I want him to wax on his desires, to be fully indulgent and happy to some extent. And Socrates questions this by asking, then those who want nothing are not truly said to be happy, end quote. Meaning that this ruler of yours isn't as happy as you think he is. And Callicles answers, no, indeed, for then stones and dead men would be the happiest of all. Socrates, but surely life, according to your view, is an awful thing. This means that, well, Callicles thinks that life is all about desires, and the ruler, being a living person, should fully indulge. And so he thinks, well, Socrates says, well, it's obviously an awful thing, life for you. He uses a kind of virtue ethics, actually, and to point out the need for temperance in the ruler, and argues towards a kind of political philosophy with virtue by way of virtue ethics, which is interesting. He then compares the life of the intemperate and the temperate, and makes an example of that, and try to distinguish good from pleasure, so that what is good is not necessarily pleasure, and that some pleasures are good and some are bad. He gets Callicles to admit that. There's a quote in here where he says, "For you will observe that we are arguing about the way of human life, and to a man who has any sense at all, what question can be more serious than this?" Emphasizing, end quote, emphasizing what the seriousness is of this, the gravity of this problem that they're undertaking, and how Socrates really wants to take life seriously. And he kind of, by saying that, obviously, it seems like Callicles, he thinks of Callicles not as someone who takes life all that seriously, and maybe out of that reason, Callicles is, because of that, Callicles is saying all these things that Socrates is trying to combat. He says this, and he tries to appeal to Callicles by asking him, making a reference to what they said at the beginning of the discussion, or in the other part which we aren't looking at, rhetoric, the way that Socrates and another guy, they agreed on that we are striving for what is good. We do what is good ultimately, and not like we don't do what is good for pleasure, but maybe we suffer or we have pleasure in order to do what's good, but the ultimate aim is the good, and Callicles agrees with that. And so Socrates makes a distinction between flattery and striving for pleasure and this striving for good, and it points out and categorizes music and rhetoric and a certain kind of rhetoric that politicians use in Athens as something to be scorned because it's striving for pleasure and not for good. He wants to point out that their, quote, rhetoric is of two sorts: mere flattery and disgraceful declamation, noble and the other of which is noble and aims at the training and improvement of the souls of the citizens, and strives to say what is best, whether welcome or unwelcome to the audience. He asks, but have you ever known such rhetoric? For indeed I do not know of such a man. End quote. I skipped a part there. But he has a very low opinion of the politicians of their time. What he is trying to point out is that this is inadequate to the pursuit of justice. Before recapitulating his points, he also asks of Callicles whether he chooses order or disorder, which will become important later, so that Callicles agrees with it. It's better to have restrainment and chastisement. At least this is what Socrates concludes from Callicles agreeing that there ought to be order rather than disorder. There's a preliminary conclusion that Socrates draws then on happiness. He says, he who does well is happy, and not just the one who's indulgent, namely, quote, who does well must of necessity be happy and blessed, end quote. Quote, who desires to be happy must pursue and practice temperance. He is for temperance, against intemperance. Also, injustice is worse to perpetrate than suffer. And yet, how do we avoid suffering anyway? He goes on then with this discussion and tries to point out that this is the wrong question that we're asking. Rather, quote, O my friend, I want you to see that the noble and the good may possibly be something different from saving or being saved. May not he who is truly a man cease to care about living a certain time? He knows, as women say, that no man can escape fate, and therefore he is not fond of life. He leaves all that with God, and considers in what way he can best spend his appointed term, whether by assimilating himself to the constitution under which he lives, so as you at the moment have to consider how you may become as like as possible to the Athenian people, if you mean to be in their good graces, and to have power in the state, because this is what Callicles is trying to do. He's a politician. Whereas I want you to think and see whether this is for the interest of either of us. I would not have us risk that which is dearest on the acquisition of this power. End quote. And Callicles replies, I think this is interesting to include here. It replies, quote, somehow or other your words, Socrates, always appear to me to be good words, and yet, like the rest of the world, I am not quite convinced by them. Socrates, the reason is, Callicles, that the love of Demos, which abides in your soul, is an adversary to me. What he means, Demos, Callicles is in love with this guy called Demos, At the beginning of this part on justice, Socrates also points out the difference between him and Callicles, and saying, well, I love Alcibiades and I love philosophy. You love this guy called Demos and the Athenian Demos. And this makes us different. So this is from here just to explain what is meant. He goes back to improving, namely, he asks Callicles, ought we not to improve the polis if we shall be a good politician, I suppose. And this has to do with what I just quoted, actually. But he says, can it be said that you have improved anyone by your conversation? He questions Callicles' own virtue, I suppose. He then points out how this is the same with statesmen. Statesmen ought to be improving people, but they're not doing that job. He goes then. He already had this discussion about the present statesman, but he points to other statesmen in the past which Callicles admires, and everyone admires and thinks are heroes, but that these statesmen, these politicians, also did a bad job at being doing justice onto the polis. For example, Pericles, who corrupted them by giving them money. Quote, and yet, if they had been really good men, as you say, these things would never have happened. All these statesmen were persecuted, and so he says this. And, quote, in the Athenian state, no one has ever shown himself to be a good statesman, unquote. Socrates makes the comparison with orators and sophists, whom he also describes as saying that they are making people more just, and they could claim to remove the injustice of the people that they are speaking to, and that they are teaching, I suppose. And so he says, quote, no statesman ever could be unjustly put to death by the city of which he is the head. And in parallel to the sophists and orators, he who removes, quote, he who removes injustice can be in no danger of being treated unjustly. This is his argument to counter this. Socrates asks Callicles, am I then to be the servant of the state, the servant and flatterer of the polis, of the people, the citizens, or am I to improve them? Am I to be the physician of the state, to make it healthier, to rid it of its sickness? And here it really shows what is the fundamental problem, then later of Plato, but let's say of the Platonic Socrates, at least in many of Plato's works. It is that of a physician trying to heal the state, trying to make the state healthier, like a physician tries to make the body healthier. The philosopher tries to make the soul healthier, and the state, in turn, by the politician, is only made healthier insofar as justice is administered, or as the politician tries to make the polis better. Callicles answers. He says, the prior, because, well, then you have bad consequences. Socrates interrupts him and says, well, I've already pointed that out. And he had. If we go back, part of what made him say that are we to avoid suffering is the wrong question, is that the bad man will kill the good. And so he again says, don't make me repeat what was already my answer, namely the bad man will kill the good. And this is harmful. and not justice. I'm not afraid or surprised even to be put to death. He says, quote, in the Athenian state, any man may suffer anything. I'll skip a few. Nor shall I be surprised if I am put to death. Shall I tell you why I anticipate this? Callicles, by all means. Socrates, I think that I am the only, or almost the only Athenian living who practices the true art of politics. I am the only politician of my time. End quote. This is another theme, I would suppose, in the figure of Socrates as presented by Plato, perhaps as presented by Xenophon. I have not read that much of Xenophon's dialogues. Or there are also other dialogues of Socrates, but it's Socrates' apparent megalomania. Maybe he sees himself as the most important, the most skillful, at least, the only one who is up to the job of a real politician. Maybe this is the real Socrates. Maybe this is just the Platonic Socrates. I suppose this could be examined further, but it's not what I'm going to do now. Who does Socrates think he is? If he is dragged to court, for example, to the Athenian court, for what he does, as a physician, he can only say, I do this for your health, your own good, for the sake of justice. This is what he can say. And dying from lack of rhetorical powers of flattery, is not a concern of his. Only to do wrong is what he is afraid of, what someone who's not a fool is afraid of. The last thing, then, is Socrates' ending story and conclusions. Listen, then, as storytellers say, to a very pretty tale which I dare say that you may be disposed to regard as a fable only, but which, as I believe, is a true tale, for I mean to speak the truth. Homer tells us how Zeus and Poseidon and Pluto divided the empire which they inherited from their father. Now, in the days of Kronos, there existed a law respecting the destiny of man, which has always been and still continues to be in heaven, that he who has lived all his life in justice and holiness, shall go, when he is dead, to the islands of the blessed, and dwell there in perfect happiness, out of the reach of evil. But that he who has lived unjustly and impiously shall go to the house of vengeance and punishment, which is called Tartarus. In the time of Kronos, and even quite lately, in the reign of Zeus, the judgment was given on the very day on which the men were to die. The judges were alive, and the men were alive, and the consequence was that the judgments were not well given. Then Pluto and the authorities from the islands of the blessed came to Zeus and said that the souls found their way to the wrong places. Zeus said, I shall put a stop to this. The judgments are not well given, because the persons who are judged have their clothes on, for they are alive. And there are many who, having evil souls, are apparelled in fair bodies, or encased in wealth or rank, and when the day of judgment arrives, numerous witnesses come forward and testify on their behalf that they have lived righteously. The judges are awed by them, and they themselves too have their clothes on when judging. Their eyes and ears and their whole bodies are interposed as a veil before their own souls. All this is a hindrance to them. There are the clothes of the judges and the clothes of the judged. What is to be done? I will tell you. In the first place, I will deprive men of the foreknowledge of death, which they possess at present. This power which they have, Prometheus has already received my orders to take from them. In the second place, they shall be entirely stripped before they are judged. For they shall be judged when they are dead, and the judge too shall be naked, that is to say, dead. He with his naked soul shall pierce into the other naked souls. And they shall die suddenly, and be deprived of all their kindred, and leave their brave attire strewn upon the earth. Conducted in this manner, the judgment will be just. I knew all about the matter before any of you, and therefore I have made my sons judges, 2 from Asia, Minos and Rhadamanthus, and 1 from Europe, Aeacus. And these, when they are dead, shall give judgment in the meadow at the parting of the ways, whence the 2 roads lead, one to the islands of the blessed, and the other to Tartarus. Rhadamanthus shall judge those who come from Asia, and Aeacus those who come from Europe, and to Minos I shall give the primacy, and he shall hold a court of appeal in case either of the 2 others are in any doubt. Then the judgment respecting the last journey of men will be as just as possible. So spoke Zeus. And the lesson that Socrates pulls from this is that at the point of death, there is the parting of the soul from the body. And so the body is kept intact, and so is the soul. But if the judges judge the soul while the body is derobed, while the soul is derobed, from the body, then, quote, when a man is stripped of the body, all the natural or acquired affections of the soul are laid open to view, end quote. And so he makes examples about how which men live more righteously, though they will be brought to the islands of the blessed, and the others to Tartarus, and so on. And there's a punishment involved, of course. The philosopher has lived in holiness and truth. He has done his own work, and not troubled himself with the doings of other men, and therefore he is just, and is also judged to be just, and goes to the island of the blessed. Ending this Gorgias with 2 quotes, which are, I suppose, characteristic of Socrates. He says, quote, "Renouncing the honours at which the world aims, I desire only to know the truth, and to live as well as I can, and, when I die, to die as well as I can. And, to the utmost of my powers, I exhort all other men to do the same." And, quote, "In this exhort all men to follow, not in the way to which you trust, and in which you exhort me to follow you. For that way, Callicles, is nothing worth." End quote.